Hi everyone, welcome to week 7. This is our first presentation on infants and toddlers. So let's jump right in. I do want to mention there's some construction going on at my house right now, and so if you hear any background noise, I apologize for that. I'm wearing headphones, so hopefully it won't be too bad, but I apologize for any background noise. So before we start to really dive deep into infant and toddler development, I first just wanted to take a moment to define infants and toddlers. I'm sure that if you asked people on the street, there might be some different views about what constitutes an infant and what constitutes a toddler. So for our purposes, infancy spans ages birth to 1 year of age, while toddlerhood spans ages 12 months to 24 months. So in this presentation and this week, we are talking about infants and toddlers ranging in age from birth to 2 years of age. And before jumping in, here are just a few considerations anytime we're talking about child development and supporting young children. We're going to start talking a little bit more as we move through the semester this week and in the following weeks about developmental milestones and developmentally appropriate practice. And it's important to keep in mind that developmental milestones are based on an average age or stage at which most of the large activities or milestones occur for typical children. So, for example, if we're talking about the milestone of walking, we will think about walking happening somewhere around 1 year of age as a milestone, but we might see an infant walking at 8 months or 9 months, or we might not see an infant start to walk until closer to 14 months or 16 months. That doesn't mean that that is incorrect or that that child's development is not on target. It just means that they were a little bit ahead or a little bit behind the average. So when we're talking about these milestones, just keep in mind that they're based on an average and they're not meant to be strictly adhered to right down to the month. It's also important to keep in mind that we will be talking about not just academic skills like math and science, but the whole child, which includes physical, social, emotional, intellectual, linguistic, adaptive, all types of skills that make up the whole child. And you will hear me continue to refer to this, but that's really what early childhood education is all about, is about supporting the whole child in order to develop fully and to have success in school and life. And lastly, I just want to make sure that as we continue to talk about supporting diverse learners and diverse families, that we keep in mind the ways that child and family characteristics such as gender, socioeconomic status, culture, ability, race, all influence development and access to learning, but that we don't stereotype these things and let them become sort of a one-size-fits-all description of these different characteristics. So for example, while we know that research supports the idea that children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds might have some catching up to do before they enter school because they might not have been exposed to as many books or as many rich conversations as children from higher socioeconomic settings. That doesn't mean that all children who are living in low-income families will experience those delays or will have any type of issues with development. It might be the case, but it's not always the case. So just keep that in mind as we move forward, talking about how these diverse characteristics influence development and learning. With that comes a little bit of a starter conversation about cultural influences on early development and the way that we need to be mindful of family priorities and family practices while also providing research and evidence-based practices to support certain skills. So for example, with feeding, we know that sometimes moms are not able to breastfeed, and that bottle feeding sometimes happens because of choice or because there were circumstances leading to bottle feeding that the mother did not choose. And so if we have personal opinions or personal biases about whether breastfeeding is better than bottle feeding, we need to keep in mind that all families will have preferences and are navigating these decisions in real time. And there might be some cultural or emotional ties to these practices that we're unaware of. For example, some cultures might prioritize adding in solid foods much earlier than others. Things like toilet training and sleeping come to mind as well. Some families and some cultures really value co-sleeping or having the child sleep in the same room or bed as the parents for a very long time, whether that's several months or whether that's several years. And other cultures and families will prioritize the child being an independent sleeper or sleeping in their own room and crib. And so we need to just be aware of the different types of decisions that parents and caregivers are making and the ways that this might be brought into our classrooms or learning environment as we try to support infants and toddlers in their natural environments and in any type of care setting that we have. So what does the research tell us about brain development? There have been a lot of developments over the last decade or two on brain development, and we now know that within the first 2 years of life, there are over 2 million synapses per second forming between neurons in the brain. This is a really quick brain development process, and this really continues to occur until age 10 or so. With that process comes the concept of neural shearing, which is this idea that any brain connections that are not used or formed during the early years of life will be eliminated. And so it's really important that children are experiencing ongoing conversations, being exposed to different environments, and really having a nurturing environment early on so that these connections are being made and we can reduce neural shearing that's happening that might result in some extra support needed when children reach school age. This also brings us to the concept of nature or genetics and nurture or the environment being traditionally viewed as competing influences on development, when really we know now that they both play an important role in typical development. For example, we know that a child's temperament is made up about 90% from hereditary and genetic factors. But we do know that the environment also plays a role in that other 10% of how a child's temperament forms. Thinking about specific types of development for infants and toddlers, let's first talk a little bit about motor development. And I just want to make sure that we're touching on these two different concepts of how motor development occurs, which the first one is cephalocaudal development. And this is the idea that development occurs from the head down to the toes. So you will see infants gaining control of their head before they're able to take control of their torso and midsection to be able to do things like sit up. And then they'll continue to develop and be able to start walking using the leg muscles and toes to move about. There's also the idea of proximodistal development, which is the concept that development occurs from the midline, or the center of the body, outwards to the extremities, which is why we see large arm and leg movements being able to happen before we see control of fingers and toes and more fine motor skills. When we think about cognitive development, if you'll recall our earlier conversations about Piaget's stages of cognitive development, infants and toddlers are really in that knowledge constructing mode all the time. Everything they do is learning. And so we see this idea of symbolic play start to develop as infants move into toddlerhood. And this is the idea that objects during play are representative of other things. An example of this is watching toddlers use blocks as people or cars, moving them about. We know that they're blocks, but toddlers are developing the ability to see those as people, or to see toilet paper rolls as binoculars or swords or other objects in play. And this is a really fun time to see those new schemes being developed as infants and toddlers are exposed to their environment. We also think about language development in infancy and toddlerhood. And language really follows a pretty interesting sequence of development as children move through those first couple of years, starting with the most basic form of communication, from crying. And we see infants moving from crying to things like cooing, smiling, babbling. And then after they get babbling down, we move into what we call approximations, which is where you'll hear children saying things like mama or dada, or you might hear a child say something like ba to stand for bottle. And then after they get approximations down, we'll start seeing more towards the toddler stage, children using one word, then two words, and then the concept of jargoning, which is where toddlers will start babbling and making sentence-like conversations, but they're nonsense words. And then after that, we really start to see the development of two-word combinations, and then the use of simple sentences with, 3, 4, 5 words, and the use of some pronouns to describe people, places, and things. When we talk about emotional development in infancy and toddlerhood, we're really thinking about those social behaviors that form the foundation of interactions with others. And these are things like crying for both attention and as a result of interaction. And we also see infants starting to imitate facial expressions, gestures, and forming emotional attachments to caregivers. It's important to think about the ways that these attachments can occur for multiple different caregivers. So children form attachments not only to their parents, but to all of those who are in their lives regularly, which includes us as early childhood professionals. We typically see 4 different attachment styles: secure, avoidant, resistant, and disorganized. And the goal is for infants and toddlers to form secure attachments so that they build trust and ongoing deep relationships with their caregivers, and they know that they are taken care of. We also want to consider the ways that early childhood mental health is now playing a role in our practice. And there is some emerging research and those urging us in the early childhood field to really consider trauma-informed practices and trauma-informed care, and to consider the ways that children's early experiences contribute to potential mental health issues. And lastly, I just want to talk for a minute about quality programs and environments. And within early childhood infant and toddler programs, this includes things like activities that are developmentally appropriate. It includes curricula that incorporates play, learning, cognitive and language experiences, and also includes an inviting, safe, comfortable, and respectful environment. The goal is to support autonomy, or infants and toddlers feeling confident to do things on their own without help. And this has several implications for teaching, including being able to engage in play and communication early on, and really building on responsive interactions in order to build trust and support individual developmental needs.